Today in Siracusa, Ring scrubs blood off the cobblestone. Ring patters against the window as a shopkeeper quietly moves money from a folder labeled Colombia to stuff protection money into an envelope. Ring soaks into the tailored suit of a newly made man as he strides out of the courthouse, a parking misdemeanor slapped onto his record after the brief murder trial. Ring battles the fires of a city worker's car after he insulted the mafiosi. The smoke still crawls up to the clouds, giving the line of Lupo around the theater something to chat about. It's not as though they have anything new to say about the ring, after all. In Siracusa, its swamp is clearly seen, felt, and acknowledged as part of its culture. But the swamp isn't unique to Siracusa. Do you know what I'm getting at, Dokutah? Well, yes, Bolivar is both a good and bad example. It's good in that it's very much like Siracusa's swamp. Life is cheap, balance is calming, factions fight for territory, and the people who simply want to live in it have to choose between dirty hands or having their innocent lives torn apart. I'm Bolivarian myself, though life has been relatively kind to me. I can't tell you any of that from experience the way Capero or Tequila can, the way Antonio could have. For all those reasons, Bolivar is a good example. But for all those reasons, it's also a bad example. Because I don't think a swamp is always blood and turf wars. No, I think it's more about the general feeling that there are evils you have no choice but to commit, no choice but to accept, and no choice but to ignore. It's civilization crumbling into a zero-sum game. When it takes the form of blood and turf wars, it's obvious, but suffering, cruelty, and corruption can take plenty of different shapes. All across Terra, there are countries with swamps in their own right. Some of them less severe, some of them simply less obvious. But think of the people who simply strive for a good life, but are forced to compromise their ideals and dirty their hands to do it. Yes, like Texas owing favors to Zaro and the Bellones when she wanted to escape Siracusa. But also like the Blood Knight, forced to turn a blind eye to the KGCC's corruption in order to secure scraps for the infected. Think of those who try to build a better system and are forced to watch it consumed and defiled by the powers that be. Yes, like Lavinia and Nuova Volsinii, forced to watch the Familia twist the laws meant to keep them out into new weapons thanks to their lawyers. But also like the people of Colombia, with their banks and insurance companies that were meant to offer opportunity, instead of bury whole plates in debt, and force the infected into poverty for even basic care. All while a parade of suits plaster on a smile as they offer to help them by shipping them off to the frontiers. All perfectly legal, of course. Think of those that, faced with these swamps, stop trying to muscle their way through it and sink to the bottom, unable to even imagine themselves escaping. They accept the swamp as inescapable reality, as natural, perhaps even necessary. Yes, like Lapland for a time, whose journey towards learning to swim in the swamp is something we'll get to, but also I'd argue like Oren, who sees ruthless massacre as the best he can do to protect Laterano from the horrors he's seeing. Speaking of drowning in the swamp, I want to be clear that I'm going to be using some language that some have used to incite anger and despair, and that's not what I want to do here. Like Eliseo learned in Londinium, if you want to make a change, you need to do two equally important things. Keep your heart focused on how the world should be, and keep your eyes open to what the world is. And while you're doing your best to keep your heart pure and your eyes open, make sure you take care of who's got your ear too. There are those who simply cry wolf and gesture vaguely to the idea of corruption, of the swamp, to justify or distract from their own evils. I won't be focusing on those sorts of people, but I just wanted to distance myself away from that sort from the outset. By the end of our talk, my hope is you'll come away not with anger or despair, but with a sense of pride in your operators and faith in the future. Speaking of, what do you say we turn our attention back to Nuova Volsinii, Siracusa's latest attempt to build something better? Let me set the stage. Nuova Volsinii is built on a newly made plate that was created to be a logistics hub for Siracusa. Some time ago, the Familia vied for control and influence of this plate, and expected a bloody battle and perhaps even a new Capo dei Capi out of the whole affair. But in the end, thanks in part to some faces you might find around roads, Nuova Volsinii became something else entirely. With a nod of approval from the Grey Hall, Leontuso, Texas, Lavinia, and yes, even Lapland, established the new city as a place that would be in name and practice separated from the familia. This sentiment would be codified into its laws, namely the New Urban Management Act, or NUMA for short. NUMA's policies and restrictions were meant to limit the familia's ability to enter, would give strength to a police force, would regulate businesses suspected of being fronts, and ensure that the law was applied fairly and justly to all. In this way, they sought to create a sanctuary from the familia. They sought to escape the swamp. So, in this clean slate of a city, why can we still find corruption? Well, first it came in the form of the surrounding swamp seeping in. Nothing in this world is ever truly a clean slate after all. Lapland compared it to trying to drape a red carpet over the marsh. The Numa prevents the familia from operating here, but Toulouse Winery eventually found its way in. Venezia trucking becomes an important part of the city. The Bologna family, restricted above and beyond other familia, attaches itself to their once enemies to gain a foothold. Nuova Volsinii's first problem is that it cannot create citizens or industry out of nothing, and all of Siracusa has long been controlled by the familia. This is the corrupt foundation that they've laid their red carpet over. Of course, these are expected tribulations. Just like how they hope to revive the energy and power behind Carnavale, but change its meaning, they hope to do the same to the industries controlled by the familia, forcing them to become proper companies. Still, while one they're prepared to face, this obstacle is a major one, especially in places like Siracusa, where corruption has seeped into the fabric of the law. That's why many trying to flee the swamp, like Texas did, prefer to run off to places with a comparably better foundation. But let's take it a step further and look at the ways the swamp seeped into Nuova Volsinii. For now, the familia can't rely on direct bloodshed, but as I said before, bloodshed and violence aren't the only form a swamp can take. The game they play can stomach all manner of rules, and the familia adapted quickly to using the rules of the Numa to serve themselves. They keep their paperwork tidy so that even Lavinia can find no just cause to fully deny them. Meanwhile, they manage paper trails to allow them to leave the blame for their actual crimes in the laps of civilians they use like stooges. And if those civilians begin to have second thoughts about doing favors with the familia, they remind them who'll be worse off when the gavel of the law comes down. In that way, the same law meant to protect people from the mafiosi becomes a weapon against them instead. The long order that codifies and punishes crime cannot stop the game, not on its own. It simply helps set the rules. It decides what any given nation's swamp looks like. And yet, those who hold it sacred often have good reason to hold firmly to it, even as they see the game evolving around them. Think of Signora Cecilia firmly stamping out threats to the balance between familia, Lavinia clenching her teeth and waiting until evidence surfaces to convince the mafiosi she suspects, Londinium's speaker enforcing Parliament's sometimes unjust laws. Even if the game continues around them, ripping the guardrails out to smack down a single criminal or to make exceptions for another can be disastrous. Imperfect laws still have value. Even the laws of the Grey Hall are a firmer foundation than the truly open conflict that Siracusa found itself in after the separating from Lithuania. Consider that without the Godmother in Grey Hall, Siracusa might have gone the way of Bolivar, and there's a reason that if you travel to Bolivar, people tell you to stick to Dos Solas. Of course, that's not to say that we shouldn't repair and replace the law when it falters. Whether through ignorance or malice, laws can be poorly made in such a way that they cause harm without any interference from lawyers with an agenda. Laws can be made that are worse than nothing. But I'll grant that you'd be hard-pressed to find those sorts of self-damaging laws in the Numa. It's not perfect, but it is well thought out and forward-thinking. My fellow Bolivarian might disagree with that distinction matters, but we'll get to him. Lavinia and her peers have clearly put a lot of thought into the Numa, and even in measures meant to keep the familia out, she veers on the side of caution. I believe it's because she and her peers understood how dangerous laws, written on a whim, can be. Harm caused by the law can lead to the swamp far faster than any familiar action. As for why, well, that brings us to what I guess I'll call my thesis statement. More so than anything else, the swamp is born out of a people's unmet needs for safety, justice, and hope. The swamp is born out of a people who lose faith in civilization taking care of them, and believe that the only way to protect themselves is to rip apart others first. Keep that in mind while we consider some stories from Nuova Volsinii. There was a trader in Nuova Volsinii who had recently earned their citizenship. happy to finally leave the familia behind. But when his brother was killed outside of their territory, both he and Lavinia knew that his brother's killers would go untouched. At the same time, if he tried to get revenge himself, he'd be in contempt of Nuova Volsinii's laws, and both he and Lavinia knew there could be no exceptions. So, he rescinded his citizenship. A tragic but small story on its own. However, those stories have a way of echoing in a city. Irene, the president of the Truckers' Union, was an incredibly bright-eyed young woman. She admired Lavinia. She bent over backwards to help the city. She had plenty of reason to loathe the mafiosi due to the tragedy in her own life. But when she had evidence in an important incident, evidence that she came to the court to give to Lavinia, she just so happened to see that case. She left the court that day and instead took the evidence to Alberto Saluzzo, Lapland's father. She decided that she had to strike a deal to make this all go away. It might be better for society when the law is impartial and firm. It might be better for society when it's changed slowly and with care. Irene wouldn't disagree. But at that moment, Irene knew that giving this case over to the law would mean her own drivers would be hurt. She knew the same law that the familia could use their resources to hide behind would not bend to show them pity, would not make an exception. If the righteous path will not offer safety, will not offer true justice, people will not simply discard their need for these things. They'll seek it out through corrupt means and hope they can pull out of the mud in time to go back to our normal life. It reminds me again of Londinium, of how the war hero whose crime was stealing a crown, only to deliver it to the Speaker of Parliament the same day, needed to be executed. Because to make an exception for her, to avoid crushing her underfoot, meant stopping Londinium's march to a brighter future. I realize it's a matter of opinion, but in my opinion, Parliament demanded a tragedy of her. And so it fell to a smidge of corruption to save her life. The war hero was still executed officially, much to the despair and anger of the people, but she was smuggled out by Milskar in a way that the Speaker could pretend not to see. But maybe you wonder if Irene's case was as noble. These drivers were working for the Familia, weren't they? True. They themselves will tell you that they gave in to temptation and need to take responsibility. But it's also true that each of these drivers had a weakness for the Familia to exploit. Addiction in some cases, money troubles in others. One case, that of a man who tearfully confessed to Irene, is a familiar one to us. He needed money to ensure his daughter had the uropathy treatment and care she needed. They had needs, and however noble or not we consider them, that doesn't change the underlying truth. If a people's needs are unmet, they will not ignore those needs. They will find other, less idealistic ways to meet them. Or, as is more often the case, less idealistic people will seek them out like wolves, smelling the blood of wounded prey. Look, I'm not trying to be a bleeding heart here, not more than usual. People do have responsibility for their choices. I could speak at length about what I feel is a perverse interpretation some have about what taking responsibility looks like, but to avoid taking another 10 or 20 minutes of your time, I'll just say this. A tragic past does not excuse oppressing's crimes. But oppressing's crimes do not excuse our responsibility to prevent those same tragedies from repeating. If a burdened beast tramples out of their pen, by all means drag it back by the scruff if you have to before it crashes into anything important. But then, the moment you can, find out why it trampled out. Fix your pen, check the brush for knobbeast nests, make sure every creature is being fed and watered. You know, I highlighted the uropathy case in particular, not just to try and tug at your heartstrings, but because it's a case we run into often. We at Rhodes hold ourselves to strong ideals about the medicine we provide, and for good reason, but we can't supply proper medicine to each and every person that needs it. So just like with Londinium's Milskar, just like with Reunion, the shoddy treatments that at least make the pain go away will fill the gap we leave behind. And look, I'll acknowledge that even in a perfect world where all reasonable needs are met, there will be those who are willing to hurt others or just engaging short-sighted corruption for more. Believe me, I know some nobles that are proof enough of that. But I still believe that as a general rule, the more people who fall between the cracks of what righteousness or lawful society can provide, the more the swamp will seep between these cracks. And then, of course, if the swamp feeds well enough, it'll start to reach out and form cracks of its own. I'm sure I don't need to waste your time listing all those who've been hurt by the familia after all. I'd be shocked if you could point to a single adult Syracusan by name who doesn't have a story about being hurt by the familia, and the cycles of violence that follow. And now we've cycled back to the start of our talk, back to how the powerful and well-off-fed familia continuously claw at Nuova Volsinii to try and take control. So, what do you say we bring this murky topic to a close, Doctor? You know, I found that vague philosophical talk is easier to keep in mind if you've got a face to attach to it. So, as a way of conclusion, why don't we look at a handful of people from the latest reported event on Siracusa and see where their stories fit into the topics we've covered today. The swamp is not only a system that allows corruption and cruelty to harm people, but the belief of those people that if they want to survive, they must dirty their hands in that same corruption. The swamp gorges itself on the cyclical suffering that stems from that. Consider Texas, who from a young age rejected all of this, but even she had to dirty her hands and make deals to escape it. Consider Lamplight and how her attempts at rebelling were used by her father. Consider how the swamp didn't only latch onto her through dirty deals and owed favors like Texas, but it seeped into her mind as this thing that only grew stronger the more she rebelled. Yet, Texas did find a way to break free. She did find people like Penguin Logistics in Rhode Island, a way out of the zero-sum game that is the Syracusan swamp. Lapland still hasn't dredged herself free of it. Instead, she's taken a different path. What that means is debatable. Maybe she wants to rule over it like an alpha. Maybe she wants destruction. Maybe she just means what she says and hopes for all of Siracusa to burn down in an act of revenge. But personally, I think it's simpler than that. I think it just means she's fully stepped away from her father. Her father, Alberto Saluzzo, like many others, responded to the swamp by trying to control everything around him. Lapland rebelled, often plotting to usurp her father, but while that might have been a challenge to him, it wasn't a challenge to the lessons he beat into her head. Become strong enough that you decide what happens. Become strong enough that you decide who suffers. And Alpha will always be at the top, so let it be you. Hating her father was never the same as rejecting him. That's why he still had a hold on her, why she couldn't escape the swamp. So, by swimming in the swamp, what I think she means that she's giving up on trying to control what happens. She's giving up on deciding who suffers. But unlike Texas, she doesn't leave. She instead spends her time putting people in the right position to make a choice about what they see. Consider less what she says and more what she does. She peels away the cloak and dagger plots of the wolven beast lords. She takes Texas on a tour of the events surrounding the accident. She crashes a standoff between the trucker union and mafiosi, in order to arm both sides. She swims through the swamp and gives as many people as she can the opportunity to choose something. To choose something important. To choose something that will change Siracusa. She gives people the power to choose something meaningful in a way she felt she was denied all her life. Now, she's not some fickle fae. She's still human. She has her own opinions about what will or should happen. She has her own feelings on what she'd like to see, and isn't above a few petty twists for her own sake. But I do think the Lapland we see now is starting to step away from being Alberto's daughter, stepping away from just being the rebellious Saluzzo girl. If she hadn't, well, maybe she'd wind up more like those who saw the swamp and simply wanted to improve their standing in it. Like Don Venezia and his ideals of decency. He's similar to Signora Cecilia in that he doesn't reject the cruelty and violence of Siracusa's swamp. He just wants to make it more palatable. He might force a tailor into years of assassination work, but he'll genuinely care to see the old man retire as happily as possible after he's been used up. When you peel back that decency, you might find a man like Antonio. In Bolivar, he learned to hate the nobles who could see human lives as things on a list, something to be scratched off if their lives were the slightest bit inconvenient. He hated it. That hate extended to the different factions of Bolivar, and all their claims of being different from each other. It extended to the sugar Venezia and his ideals of decency piled on top of their sings. It extended even to Lavinia. I believe his view was muddled by his past, but he saw her and the Noom as just another coat of paint on the same reality. Someone always gets to decide who suffers. And, well, we've already talked about how the law can fail its people, about how people can fall into the cracks. about how people can, justly or not, be left to die or executed for the sake of upholding its sanctity. Antonio, I think, is the clearest vision we get of the swamp. A man who can no longer believe in the grace of anyone. A man who doesn't strive to change the system he hates, just wants to be at the top of the pile so he can decide who suffers. But what of those who hate the swamp and want to build something better on top of it? Well, we have Lavinia, the judge. She tries her best to create a new set of rules, and she's one of the most unwavering people I've had the pleasure of knowing. She does her best to make sure that the letter of the law is well drawn and holds firmly to it, in the face of personal emotion, of bribery and intimidation, to make sure it doesn't bend an inch. She's, I believe, the one most like Signora Cecilia, who years ago also brought a set of laws to Siracusa, and enforces its core tenets with a firm hand. They're like in more ways than one, because while they hold firm against those that try to bend or break their rules, they both understand that their rules aren't perfect. They both hope for the day that someone will climb upon their backs, upon the foundation they've made possible, and build something even better. It's why Cecilia gave her support to these young upstarts in their dream of a new city. It's why Lavinia stands behind Leontuso, the former Bologna heir, and now soon-to-be mayor of Nuova Volsinii. Speaking of Leontuso, while he spends most of the latest events unconscious, his speech is what gives me the most hope for the future of Nuova Volsinii, and I believe he'll be a fine mayor. Consider the points I've been battering you with. Civilizations always have cracks and people who fall in between them. It's easy, good politics even, to ignore these cracks, to simply accept that these things are inevitable, or at least unimportant enough in the face of the greater good. Put another way, it's temptingly convenient to just draw a red line around the lives and issues you can take care of, and dismiss the rest. But Leontuso doesn't do that. He acknowledges many of the faults I've laid out today. He seeks out the cracks where the swamp will seep in and speaks of them with enough insight that I believe his words are more than just empty promises when he swears to do all he can to mend these faults. And if he doesn't, if he can't, if staring into the abyss gets to be too much, well, at least he's not setting himself up to be a tyrant. There will be those to keep him in check. Irene may have lost her idealism and resorted to the Familia's own tactics to try and stomp them out. But she hasn't yet crossed that line of no return, as dangerously close as she came. And should she ever falter, the Crown Slayer will watch over her. And should the Crown Slayer lose her way, well, now that she's here, we can do our best to support and guide her. I wonder if you understand now why I said earlier that as depressing and melodramatic as my description of the swamp might be, I didn't want you to take it as a rallying cry to abandoning all ideals to face it, or to despair about the impossibility of it. The swamp is a malignant thing that grows out of a people's suffering, not only in Siracusa, but all throughout Terra. It's complicated in a way that's utter arrogance to pretend to totally understand. It's an enemy that seeps into your own skin the more you struggle against it. And yet, given the opportunity, I believe that people really can build something better. Not just because of any one person clawing their way to the top, but because of so many people willing to trudge through and pull each other up when they need it. I had originally prepared this report focusing on just Lapland, but the more I wrote it, the more I understood what I think she realized first. The story of the swamp isn't about any one person. And so, to have any meaning, the story about standing against the swamp must have a whole cast, not just a lead actress. And I suppose that means it should have more than one narrator, too. I'm looking forward to hearing about what you think, Dokutah. But why don't we get a change of scenery first? I hear there is a, pardon my poor Siracusan, Milafoya in the cafeteria. Lapland might actually have my head if I keep you from trying some.